In 1895, a camp cook in the Ottawa Valley fed 60 men from a single cast iron pot. No refrigeration, no grocery run, just salt pork, root vegetables, and 12 hours of slow heat over a log fire. The shantymen called him the King of the Camboose. Number 18 on this list was so important that lumber bosses hired and fired entire crews based on whether the cook could get it right. And number 7 created a chemical reaction in cast iron that modern slow cookers literally cannot replicate. These stews kept Canada's timber industry alive for over a century. 7,000 calories a day, eaten in silence, in 15 minutes flat. Before we begin, hit subscribe, because these 30 forgotten recipes are the reason your house is standing. Let us count them down. Number 30, salt pork and potato stew anchored the earliest shanty camps of the Ottawa Valley when the timber trade was still young and supply lines barely existed. Cooks dropped thick slabs of barrel-cured pork into cast iron pots with creek water, then added quartered potatoes by the bucketful. By the 1840s, a barrel of salt pork cost around $4 and had to last a crew of 40 men the better part of a month. The stew simmered from before dawn until the midday meal, the fat rendering slowly into the broth until every potato turned translucent and rich. Shantymen ate without speaking, scooping stew onto tin plates with hunks of fresh bread. There was no seasoning beyond salt and whatever pepper the cook had remembered to bring. Yet that simple combination of pork fat and starch kept men swinging axes in -30 for 10 hours straight. When fresh supplies ran out in February, this stew was often the only thing between a crew and starvation. Number 29. Boiled beef and turnip stew replaced salt pork when a camp received a fresh quarter of beef hauled in by ox sled. Cooks carved the toughest cuts, shin and neck mostly, into rough chunks and dropped them into the pot with peeled turnips. The beef was rarely tender, even after hours of simmering, but the turnips absorbed every drop of flavor, turning sweet and soft, and the broth itself became the prize. Men drank it straight from tin cups to warm their insides before heading back into the cutting. By the 1870s, camps along the Madawaska and Bonnechere rivers considered fresh beef a luxury reserved for the first weeks of the season. Number 28. Bean and bacon stew was the backbone of every logging camp from New Brunswick to northern Ontario. Dried white beans were soaked overnight, then simmered all day with chunks of side bacon and a whole onion. The cookie kept the fire fed, and the pot topped with water so the beans never scorched. Camps in the Gatineau Valley in the 1880s went through nearly a barrel of dried beans every week. The slow simmer broke the beans down until they thickened the broth into something almost paste-like, heavy enough to fuel a 12-hour shift hauling timber. This was not Boston baked beans. This was survival food, dense and plain, eaten fast and appreciated later when the warmth settled into frozen bones. Number 27, PEA soup with salt pork was the French-Canadian answer to the English bean stew, and in the camps of Quebec, it ruled the cookhouse. Dried yellow split peas simmered for hours with a hock of salt pork, diced onion, and sometimes a carrot if the supply wagon had been generous. The soup cooked down so thick a spoon could stand upright in the pot. French-speaking shantymen from the Laurentians grew up on the soup. Their mothers made it, their grandmothers made it, and finding it in a bush camp 200 kilometers from home meant something. By the 1890s, camps that employed French-Canadian crews knew that serving proper pea soup was not optional. A cook who could not make it would lose half his men to a rival camp by January. Number 26. Ox cheek stew appeared when a working animal was too old or injured to haul logs and went straight to the cookhouse. The cheeks were dense with collagen, which broke down over 8 hours into a rich, gelatinous broth. Cooks added potatoes, onions, and a handful of dried herbs brought from home. One ox cheek could flavor a stew for 30 men. Teamsters who had worked alongside the animal sometimes refused to eat, but most did, quietly and without sentiment. In the Trent Valley camps of the 1860s, losing an ox was both a setback and a feast day, and the stew that followed was remembered long after the animal was forgotten. Number 25, rabbit and root vegetable stew kept smaller camps alive when supply wagons could not break through snowdrifts. Trappers set snares along the tree line, pulling in snowshoe hare by the dozen. The cook skinned and jointed them fast, dropped the pieces into the pot with whatever roots were left, carrots, parsnips, turnips, and simmered the lot until the meat fell from the bone. Rabbit was lean, almost too lean, so cooks added salt pork or lard to give the broth body. In camps along the Miramichi River during the 1870s, rabbit stew showed up 3 or 4 times a week during hard stretches. The broth was thin, but it was hot, and in the bush, hot food was the difference between working and freezing. Number 24, venison stew stretched the bounty of a single deer across an entire week. Shoulder and neck went into the pot with potatoes, onions, and water. The tougher the cut, the longer it simmered, sometimes 14 hours over banked coals overnight. By morning, the meat fell apart into dark, gamey shreds. Camps in the Algoma district relied on venison when beef shipments were delayed by weather. The wild flavor divided the men. French-Canadian loggers from farm country found it strong. Indigenous and Métis workers who grew up on bushmeat considered it ordinary. Either way, the pot was always empty by the second serving. Number 23, pork hock and cabbage stew brought a taste of the old country to camps filled with Irish and Scottish immigrants. A single smoked pork hock simmered all day with quartered cabbage and potatoes. The hock released smoky, salty flavor slowly, and the cabbage softened into sweet, silky ribbons. By the 1850s, Irish workers made up a significant portion of the Ottawa Valley timber crews, and the cooks who kept them happy knew this stew by heart. It was peasant food transplanted into the Canadian bush, familiar enough to ease homesickness, and hearty enough to fuel the hardest labor the New World could offer. First pattern break. The cook in a Canadian logging camp was not just a cook. He was the most important man in the operation. Lumber bosses in the 1880s paid a good camp cook nearly double what a regular shantyman earned, sometimes $35 a month, when loggers made $18. A bad cook emptied a camp faster than low wages or dangerous conditions ever could. Men would walk out in January, trudge 50 kilometers through deep snow to a rival operation, all because the stew was thin or the bread was heavy. The cookhouse centered around the camboose, a massive open hearth where cast iron pots hung from iron cranes over a fire that never went out. The cook rose at 3:30 in the morning, worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, and if the food was good, the men treated him with a respect bordering on reverence. If the food was bad, they left without a word, and the lumber boss lost his entire season. Number 21. Barley and beef shank stew thickened the pot in camps across northern Ontario, where pearl barley arrived by the sack alongside flour and oats. The barley swelled as it cooked, absorbing the marrow-rich broth until the stew became almost porridge-like. A 50-pound sack cost less than $2 in the 1890s, and it stretched further than potatoes. The shank bones cracked open during the simmer, releasing marrow directly into the broth. Men from Scottish immigrant families recognized this stew instantly. For them, it was a taste of something older than Canada itself. Number 20. Smoked fish and potato chowder appeared in camps near the Great Lakes, where whitefish and pike could be caught and smoked for winter. The cook flaked the smoked fish into simmering potatoes and onions, sometimes adding evaporated milk. The result was a thick, smoky chowder that tasted nothing like the salt pork stews the men ate 6 days a week. In camps along the French River, fish chowder showed up on Fridays for Catholic crews who observed the fast from meat. The cook treated those days seriously because a man denied meat needed something equally filling. Number 19. Moose stew was the trophy meal of the northern bush camps. A bull moose could dress out at over 500 pounds, and the tougher cuts went straight into the cast iron pot. The meat was dark, lean, and intensely flavored, requiring a full day of simmering. Cooks added potatoes, turnips, and onions in rough chunks. In the camps of northern Quebec and the Abitibi region, moose stew was an event. Men talked about it for weeks afterward, measuring the quality of their winter by whether they had eaten moose or been stuck with salt pork. A camp that served moose stew twice in one season was considered blessed. Number 18. Whole beans simmered longer than anything else in the camp. The cookie soaked dried beans overnight, parboiled them, then packed them into a cast iron kettle with salt pork, onion, dry mustard, and a generous pour of molasses. He sealed the lid tight and buried the pot in a pit of hot coals covered with earth. The beans cooked underground for 12 to 16 hours, emerging the next morning dark, sweet, and impossibly tender. Every camp had its bean hole, a permanent pit dug near the cookhouse and lined with stones. The cookie tended it daily, building fresh fires and burying fresh pots in an endless rotation. Lumber bosses judged a cook's worth by his beanhole beans above all else. Number 17. Corned beef and root vegetable stew relied on barrels of brined beef shipped north before the rivers froze. The cook carved thick slabs, rinsed excess salt, then simmered the meat with carrots, parsnips, potatoes, and cabbage wedges. The brine had preserved the beef for months, and the long simmer mellowed the salt, while the fat rendered into a savory, slightly pink broth. A barrel cost around $6 in the 1880s and could feed a 40-man crew for 2 weeks, stretched with enough vegetables and bread. Number 16, dried apple and pork stew sounds strange to modern ears, but in the bush camps of the 1860s, dried apples were one of the only fruits available. Cooks rehydrated rings of dried apple alongside salt pork and potatoes, creating a sweet and savory combination. The apples broke down during the long simmer, thickening the broth and cutting through the heavy salt. A bushel cost less than $1 and weighed almost nothing. Some cooks added cinnamon when they had it. The men either loved it or tolerated it without complaint. Number 15. Oxtail stew brought the richest broth in the cookhouse. Cooks browned the jointed tails until the fat crisped, then submerged them with onions, carrots, and potatoes. The collagen dissolved over hours, turning the broth glossy and coating every surface it touched. In camps along the Ottawa River during the 1870s, oxtails arrived with the beef quarters and were considered the cook's reward. He kept the best pieces for his own pot, building a stew so rich the foreman himself came looking for a second bowl. When camps switched to cheaper tinned beef in later decades, oxtail stew was one of the first casualties, and the men knew the difference immediately. Second pattern break. Talking during meals was forbidden, not merely discouraged. In camps across Ontario and Quebec from the 1850s through the early 1900s, the cook enforced absolute silence in the cookhouse. The men filed in, sat down, ate, and left. 15 minutes. The rule existed for practical reasons. 60 men eating fast in a tight space created chaos if talking was allowed. The only sounds were the scrape of tin spoons on tin plates and the fire crackling in the camboose. If a man wanted more stew, he pointed at the pot. The cookie filled his plate. Men who broke the silence rule were warned once. The second time, they ate outside in the cold. The third time, they were gone. Number 13, head cheese. Stew recycled every scrap from pork butchering days. The cook simmered the head, ears, trotters, and skin for hours until the meat fell from the bone and the broth turned thick with gelatin. He shredded everything back into the pot with vinegar, pepper, and onion, creating a tangy, rich stew that set firm when cooled, but loosened when reheated. Camps that kept their own pigs produced head cheese stew at least once a month. Nothing went to waste. Number 12. Bully beef stew arrived with the tinned rations that transformed supply logistics after the turn of the century. Cooks crumbled dense, pink, pressed beef into the pot with potatoes and onions, simmering until everything merged into a thick, salty hash. By the 19-teens, remote camps in British Columbia and northern Ontario relied heavily on bully beef when fresh supplies could not get through. The stew was dependable, if uninspired, and a cook who could make it taste good earned a reputation that followed him from camp to camp. Number 11. Trapper's stew combined whatever a camp's hunter brought in on a given day. Partridge, hare, squirrel, muskrat. The cook took it all, cleaned and jointed the animals, and dropped them into the communal pot with root vegetables. The result was unpredictable. Some days it tasted like game bird. Other days it was musky from muskrat or beaver. Indigenous workers brought knowledge of bushmeat that elevated these stews from desperation, cooking into something genuinely good. Number 10. Habitant pea soup with smoked ham was the refined version of entry 27, made with whole yellow peas, a smoked ham hock, diced carrots, celery root, and dried savory. The soup simmered all day, the ham hock collapsing until the bone slid out clean. In the camps of the Maurici and the Laurentians, habitant soup was the soul of the cookhouse. A cook who made it well was called a real cuisinier. A cook who failed was called something considerably less polite. Behind every great camp, cook stood the cookie, a boy between 14 and 18 who did everything the cook would not. He woke at 3 in the morning, lit the fires, hauled water, scrubbed pots, peeled potatoes, and tended the bean hole. He carried the midday meal out to the men in the bush on a horse-drawn sledge, building a fire in the snow so the loggers could eat without freezing. For this, he earned about $12 a month in the 1890s. Many of Canada's greatest camp cooks started as cookies, learning through exhaustion and observation. The position was a rite of passage in logging country, and the boys who survived a full winter earned a toughness that lasted a lifetime. Number 8. Shin beef and dumpling stew brought British suet dumplings into the Canadian bush, carried by English and Scottish immigrants who refused to eat stew without something floury in it. The cook browned shin beef, simmered it for hours, then dropped balls of flour, suet and salt into the bubbling pot an hour before serving. The dumplings swelled, absorbing beefy broth and turning dense and satisfying. Some men ignored the beef entirely, eating only the dumplings soaked in gravy. In Renfrew County, dumpling stew was a Thursday fixture through the 1880s and the 1890s. Number 7. Lumberjack boiled dinner was the one-pot masterpiece every great camp cook built his reputation on. Salt beef went in first, and it simmered for hours. Then whole potatoes, quartered turnips, carrots, parsnips, onions, and finally cabbage wedges. Everything cooked together, each vegetable absorbing the salt and fat while releasing its own flavor. The cast iron pot was critical. Heavy walls distributed heat evenly, and the iron itself released trace minerals that created a depth of flavor no steel pot could match. Food scientists have since confirmed that cooking acidic foods in cast iron increases the iron content significantly. The shantymen did not know the science. They just knew that stew from the big black pot tasted better than anything else, and they were right. Number 6. Pork and molasses baked stew combined the two most abundant camp ingredients into something that bordered on confection. Salt. Pork simmered in water, molasses, mustard, and onion for hours until the pork caramelized and the sauce turned dark and sticky. A gallon of molasses cost about 40 cents in the 1880s. The sugar delivered quick energy, and the iron in the molasses helped prevent the anemia that plagued men on restricted winter diets. Some cooks added vinegar to balance the sweetness, creating a crude, sweet and sour effect the men found addictive. Number 5. Tourtière stew was the deconstructed version of Quebec's famous meat pie. Ground pork simmered with diced potatoes, onions, and the holy trinity of French-Canadian spicing, cloves, cinnamon, and allspice. The stew thickened as the potatoes broke down. In camps with French-Canadian crews, it appeared at Christmas and New Year when homesickness ran highest. The spices perfumed the cookhouse with a smell so closely tied to home that grown men went quiet when they caught the first whiff. It was comfort food in the most literal sense, a taste of the parish kitchen carried into the frozen wilderness. Number 4, fish head chowder used the parts of the catch that squeamish cooks threw away. Heads of lake trout, pike, and whitefish simmered with potatoes, onions, and salt pork in a broth that turned milky and opaque. The cheek meat was the delicacy, small pockets of tender flesh the cook ate himself if nobody was watching. In camps along the north shore of Lake Huron, fish head chowder marked a cook who wasted nothing and understood flavor. Number 3, ragout de pattes, pig's feet ragout, separated the real bush cooks from the pretenders. Pig's feet were split in half, browned in lard, then simmered for hours with onions, potatoes, and sometimes meatballs. The feet released collagen slowly, turning the broth into a velvety, mahogany-colored sauce. It was seasoned with clove, cinnamon, and black pepper. In the Gatineau and Saint Maurice valleys, ragout de pattes appeared on Sundays and holidays. The texture was unlike anything in English-Canadian cooking, rich and sticky, coating the mouth with warmth that outlasted the meal. Number 2, Jig's dinner stew was the Newfoundland contribution, carried west by outport men who left the rock for winter work in the Ontario and Quebec bush. Salt beef, split peas, cabbage, turnip, carrot, potato, and sometimes a figgy duff pudding bag all went into the same massive pâté. The salt beef went in first, then the peas in a cloth bag, then the root vegetables and cabbage last. The pot liquor ran dark and savory, and it was fought over as fiercely as the meat itself. Newfoundland loggers judged a camp by whether the cook could make a proper Jig's dinner. If he could, they stayed. If he could not, they walked. Number 1. The perpetual stew never ended and never emptied. In the oldest camps across Canada, the cook kept a single cast iron pot simmering from the first day of the season until the last man left in spring. Every day he added whatever was available: salt pork on Monday, potatoes and turnips on Tuesday, a rabbit on Wednesday, bones from the butchering, vegetable scraps. The stew evolved constantly, its flavor deepening with every addition. The iron pot seasoning the broth in ways that accumulated over months. No 2 spoonfuls tasted the same, but every spoonful carried the memory of everything that came before. When the camp broke up in April, the cook finally let the fire die. Some claimed they never washed that pot. They covered it, stored it, and started next season's stew in the same vessel. The flavor, they said, was already in the iron. These 30 stews are more than recipes. They are the taste of the Canadian bush, of frozen rivers and falling timber, and men who ate in silence and worked until dark. Try one this winter: a simple pea soup with a smoked hawk, a pot of whole beans buried in your backyard, a slow-simmered boiled dinner in the heaviest cast iron pot you own. Then come back and tell me which one you are making in the comments. I want to know if the perpetual stew wins or if the habitant pea soup takes the crown. Because these were not just meals, they were the fuel that built this country, one bowl at a time.